This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Thank you, Dawa. Thank you. So, hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to week, can you believe it, number 4. I've gotten some wonderful, helpful, thought-provoking responses from you, and I just wanted to go through some of them and answer questions and comments. Someone, someone looked at this week's assignment about 5 minutes of great teaching, and, and responded to me, well, it may be 5 minutes of great teaching, but it's above my pay grade. I put it in there for that reason, in a sense, to kind of show the breadth of this man's, first of all, not of all, ability to communicate to certain audiences. So he can talk to children at a young people's concert, he can talk to the nation on an omnibus concert, but he also is able, for example, in those Harvard lectures, to dig deeply into a subject. Sometimes it's too deep for most of us. So several of you people wrote about the review in this week's New York Times by Tomasini, reviewing the contemporary opera that is now being presented at the Metropolitan Opera by an African American composer about an African American character, Fire, and how they were comparing Tomasini's review of Trouble in Tahiti as opposed to his review of Fire. A lot of the same language, but ways. Someone asked me, I said last week that it's my understanding that Leonard Bernstein just dealt with lots of conflict in his life. And someone said, can you elaborate on that? Well, I can, from the outside and many, many years hence, I can try. There are a variety of them. The conflict certainly as to what kind of a musician he was going to be. And he had on the one hand his favorite teacher, Serge Koussevitzky, saying, don't waste your time with all this Broadway stuff and these show tunes. Compose, quote, serious music. And on the other hand, people like Jerry Robbins and Stephen Sondheim saying, you're a genius at writing theater music. But he was always torn between the kinds of music that he was writing and the critics of that kind of music. He was also torn between, am I a conductor? Am I a composer? Am I a teacher? Am I a social gadfly? And he was constantly moving between these worlds. And other people have done it. It's Gustav Mahler, for example. He didn't write Broadway shows, but he was both a conductor and a composer. Esa-Pekka Salonen, who is our new conductor of the San Francisco Symphony, he is a composer and a conductor and a phenomenal teacher as well. And of course, Bernstein's own ambivalence in terms of his relationships with his wife, with his family, with his lovers in his life, and trying to navigate. And remember, he was navigating this social construct in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when our country was in a very different place than it is now. Someone said, they had enjoyed watching Lenny speak to the audience. They asked, does he speak, was this typical of Leonard Bernstein? Certainly in the Young People's Concerts and that omnibus series, but also, and we're going to see a couple of examples of this today, he would speak before or during a concert in a way to engage and to involve the audience. So it was not something new with him, but certainly something that appealed to his audiences and to young me as a potential music student. Someone asked about the film where there's a lot of his conducting examples, and that is the film that I had assigned earlier on called Reaching for the Note. If I could have assigned that film to you all before the first class, I could have put the first two classes into one at most, but it's a wonderful reference point to go back into that film. One of the things that someone said to me, what did you hope we learned last week? And looking at him as a conductor. And my answer is for me, is how he navigated. Again, it's one of those conflicts. How he navigated between the emotional Kusevitsky as a conductor and the very strict Fritz Reiner. And what I find fascinating about him is how he was able to embrace both of that Apollonian and Dionysian side of conducting and making music. He was able to combine those, to bring them together. But one of the things that kept impressing me, and it does today as he teaches young conductors we're going to watch, is how he constantly returns to the score, to whatever the composer, whatever she or he wrote down, and how Lenny as the conductor is trying to realize that, but he knows you have to go deep into the process. And someone, of course, wrote to me about my statement about women conductors. I was not saying, I hope you understand, I was not saying there are no women conductors today. There are some phenomenal people out there, particularly in Europe, who are conductors, and here women who are assistant or associate conductors, but there's no prominent American symphony orchestra today, with the exception of Baltimore, where the conductor is getting ready to leave, Marin Alsop. So there really are no principal conductors of the United States major symphony orchestras who are women. Sad, but it's the way that's the way it is. And then in conclusion, I got a lovely note a couple of days ago from someone who many of you know. He's a member of our board at the Fromm. He has taken well over 200, and are you ready? 250 classes at the Fromm Institute. This is from Albert Frankel, and he encloses a photograph of his son. And let me share this. What can I do? I guess I cannot, but maybe if I hold it back like that, it stays in focus. This is Albert Frankel and his son Jeffrey at a dinner party with Leonard Bernstein. Mark Leno apparently had met Bernstein and had a dinner party in San Francisco and invited Jeffrey Frankel, who got to sit next to him. Later on, he says Jeff was invited to the Bernstein's apartment at the Dakota in New York City. So I just love these personal connections. A number of you have talked about going to children's concerts, but by being able to have this photo of you or your son with this famous man only a year before he died. So that's sort of question and answer time for today. Again, welcome to you all. Give me just a moment to set up my screen share and we're ready to go. Are you still there? Okay, well, we've been thinking about watching, let me start the sentence again. I hope we're beginning to grow in our own understanding of this man and as a musician, as a cultural force. I've spent a lot of time this week sort of reflecting in my own mind what kind of a role he played in my life. And I was able to go back and find this original edition of his book, The Joy of Music. This is from the early 50s, and it's nearly falling apart. But it was the first book about Bernstein that I had, and I realized as a kid how blown away I was by this man. I think there were two musicians in my life who helped me see the way clear to becoming a musician myself. The first one was Robert Shaw, who became conductor of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. But I remember him bringing his Robert Shaw chorale to Chicago when I was an undergraduate, going to a concert, being swept off my feet and thinking, that's what I want to do. I want to do choral music and I want to be a conductor and a teacher. But the other one was Leonard Bernstein. He had a profound effect on me in his ability to communicate and teach. And I thought, well, he taught me to be a teacher. Why don't I teach you all? So today, I want to teach you all one of the pieces of Leonard Bernstein. Are you ready? Here we go.
Hello there. I've been thinking, maybe since this week we're discussing Lenny as a teacher, it might be good to use some of Lenny's own music on my part to be a teacher with you. And I played for you last week a little bit of one of the anniversaries these little portraits that Lenny composed of different people in his life. This is the one called For Aaron Stern. And I want to talk a little bit about how Bernstein takes what we expect to have happen and throws a little wrench in the works, makes a slight change, which seems to surprise us, and then to sort of propel the music forward or to propel the music into a place we don't even expect. So, for example, in the middle of the piece, you have this sort of melodic line going on. Perfectly beautiful, simple line. And normally one would expect to hear it sort of accompanied. But instead of what we expect, he throws in a different note. And it sounds dissonant to us, and yet the more we hear it, the more natural it becomes. So we have this pattern. Similar surprise happens in the last few moments of the piece. We get to the end of the piece and we're sitting here with this little melodic line. Normally a composer would end it like that. Not Lenny Bernstein. He gets to this melody. And then, as if that's not enough, he ends with this note. So this piece, the tiny miniature, contains these very gentle, subtle surprises that gives it the Bernstein sound. And it was so natural for him. Here's the piece.
That was nice to do a little piano lesson here today, just to explain these in this tiny world of his of this short piece. It's quintessentially Leonard Bernstein, but it's very, very subtle. So how do we approach Lenny as a teacher? Here's what I propose we undertake today. We must first of all understand that teaching was the MO for Leonard Bernstein. He lived to teach and to learn. And remember, we talked a few weeks ago discussing that German word lernen und lehren, to learn and to teach, and how they are entwined with one another. And I say, my grandchildren still find it amazing when I say, I'm busy learning, and they look at me and they say, but Grandpa, you're a teacher. Well, a good teacher, I think, is always a learner. And to sort of see where his teaching is rooted, where out of what milieu did his teaching grow? Where did he learn about what a good teacher is and what the value of a teacher is? And that was at Tanglewood. So we'll spend some time looking at that and then seeing how his family today, some many years after his death, is keeping his legacy alive through a special in-school program for kids that we'll explore just a little bit. In terms of him being a teacher, we can't not remembering that Bernstein came to the Philharmonic at a time when television was in its infancy and was just beginning to burst forth. And he captured that in terms of its being such a powerful medium. And then as we come towards the end of our day together, I want to do a little segment called What's the Score? What's the musical score? And I want to look at how Leonard Bernstein, for all of his ability as a composer, his ability to explain, to dig deep into another composer's music and make it understandable to us was one of his strongest points. And we'll do that as we come to the end. Here's Lenny just talking quickly about what it means to be a teacher.
You may think it strange that I've chosen to open the season of Young People's Concerts with the subject of teachers. Because after all, aren't these programs always about music? And what have teachers got to do with music? Well, the answer is everything. We can all imagine a painter who's self-taught, or a writer, but it's almost impossible to imagine a professional musician who doesn't owe something to one teacher or another. The trouble is that we don't always realize how important teachers are in music or in anything else. Teaching is probably the noblest profession in the world, the most unselfish, difficult, and honorable profession. But it's also the most unappreciated, underrated, underpaid, and underpraised in the world. And so today we are going to praise teachers.
And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to praise. Where did it all start for Lenny? Well, it was the Tanglewood Music Center, which now, it started in 1938, 39, and 40, now is a fixture at the Tanglewood Music Center near Lenox, Massachusetts. And it's a summer music academy in which young, emerging professional musicians can participate in performances, in master classes, in workshops. They can study conducting, composing, and playing in an orchestra, singing in a chorus. And it was really founded by Serge Koussevitzky as an where students, young students, could work closely with faculty members who were members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, as well as guest artists who came in. And several thousand people apply each year to get into this very exclusive cadre of young musicians, and usually only if 150 plus students are chosen. Here's how Koussevitzky sort of described it in its very, very earliest days. He says, the Berkshire Music Center presents a unique opportunity for a summer of living and working in music. I love that. The Music Center is designed to lay special emphasis upon those aspects of music education concerned with collective performance, will thus supplement rather than duplicate the training available in established schools of music. What an opportunity it is for these young players to come together, to get to know one another, to experience one another, to listen to one another, to watch one another. And that was 1940 for the very opening exercises. Here's Lenny in a 1951 speech saying, Tanglewood is not a school. It does not offer courses, degrees, credit. No student is striving for grades. The goals are higher than that. Tanglewood is a musical universe where a young musician is subjected to gravitational pulls, magnetic fields, electrical impulses, varying atmospheres, and changing topography. What he emerges with, or she emerges with, after it is all over, is not a report card or the ability to play faster than the next fellow, What Tanglewood hopes and what Kusevitsky desired was that the student emerged from this model universe with a conception of a true orbit, that the young planet acquire its direction, its sense of relationship to its fellow planets, and its particular function in the larger universe outside. Typical Lenny, going into this metaphor of the planets to describe this place. The physical surroundings are absolutely beautiful. There is, which has been there for a number of years, which houses many people in the sit-down audience, but with a huge lawn outside where people can bring their picnic suppers. Seiji Ozawa Hall, which was opened in 1994 and has received a number of awards for its quality architecture. And if you've been to the Green Music Center Weil Hall, which opened in 2012 with the same architect and basically the same design. As you walk the grounds, you're going to find the busts of three very important people. From the right side, Serge Kusevitsky. The middle is Kusevitsky, who was buried there. In the middle, Aaron Copland, who was a spirit who inhabits the place, is also buried there. And the more recent bust, given by the composer John Williams, of Leonard Bernstein. So Copland was a vital part of Lenny's education, but a vital part of Tanglewood and its young students. Here they both are.
He still spends part of every summer at Tanglewood. That's because that is where the future is, where young people of music are.
Aaron, the main thing is you've got to meet these young composers because they're so wonderful. You'd be so happy if you heard their music. Well, there's one right in front of you called Paul Bradley. He's from Georgia. There's Dan Polkovsky, who's incredibly talented. And there's one of the most talented, which is Bright Ching, who's just here 3 years from China. Catherine Harris, conductors. There's a young conductor from England called Llewellyn.
Begins to look like Tangle.
I began as a stinky little student. You began in the faculty. So we began together in rather different capacities.
We ended up with you on the faculty and I was a student.
Yeah, sort of. You will wait till you hear the outdoor overture, which will be conducted by that girl there. This is an Israeli conductor called Giselle Woodcock, who is going to conduct the outdoor overture.
Tanglewood is the birthplace of a number of conductors whom we all know, not just Lenny Bernstein, but a whole group of conductors, and obviously perhaps the most important one being for our world is Michael Tilson Thomas. And as we already know, Leonard Bernstein really was a kind of conducting father for him, and in a sense taught MTT what it is to relate beyond the music to an audience, which MTT obviously has done brilliantly. Let's look at someone getting a conducting lesson. And the first person I think for us to encounter is Maren Alsop. And here we see Lenny teaching her to conduct.
Before the piano each time.
Each time, not this time. I think not.
Well,
yes.
Why not? Why not all the time?
Oh, this is such a surprise. A beautiful, warm
See,
space.
you cut this off.
Yes.
There's a hole.
Yes. So we try
this
to
way, there's no.
Mm-hmm.
Notice how deeply he goes into the score. We're in one measure.
I know, a little tricky, huh? Well, you stay here, okay?
Also, I do the I do the ornament differently too, but we'll talk about that.
Okay, good, wonderful.
In days to come. All right.
So I'm trying. Am I allowed to tell? I'm trying to no space before we go on to the piano after the first fermata. I think really I would have gone to the moon to work with Leonard Bernstein.
And she is one of his principal students. Another one is Seiji Ozawa, for example. Here's a wonderful recording of Ozawa sort of narrating, but we encounter Lenny as he attempts to say what he learned himself as a conductor studying with Kusevitsky, but then how he's passing it on to others.
However, I did get from Kusevitsky himself the sense of legato and the sense of what happens between beats. This is so important. And this is what I never stop talking about, to the boredom and rage and frustration of all my pupils all over the world.
All das, was Bernstein bei Kusevitsky in Tanglewood gelernt hatte, vermittelt er nun seinen Schülern in aller Welt, sei es in Fontainebleau, Los Angeles oder Schleswig-Holstein.
Can we take right on that?
And the other thing is, they still don't know how to come out with fortissimo. Because you don't show them. What bar is that? The famous bar, what? Nine. Or let's think the famous bar 9. There. All right. What did I do?
Nothing. You just
tell me, so I can tell you. There's no. I don't want you to imitate.
I know.
I want you to understand why. Do the bar before. Look, do it with me. You have the stick. Look, bar, no hands. See, what did I do?
You get more of this.
You hold it and show them where they, before they do it. Then here, all these contrasting fortes and pianos. Yeah, and. It is what is between the beats, because a beat is no good. Once you've given it, they've already played that. It's too late. Everything is in the preparation for that beat. And so between one beat and the next, you prepare beats. It's the inner beats that are important. And Kusevitsky, without saying all that, because he had never taught before and he didn't have it systematized, showed me. He said, then you conduct, for example, the slow movement of this Randall Thompson symphony that I was assigned that week. He said, it must be warm, like the sun come up, warm, 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. And in saying that, he was saying the whole system of inner beats, just by doing it and saying, and 3 and 4. Keep the line going.
F, please.
The moral is don't stop unless you really have something to say.
Well, this is what I heard. Maybe it was wrong.
Yeah, but I mean, it happens with young conductors all the time, and it's nothing to be ashamed of.
No.
I was a young conductor.
Professor Bailey, can you raise the volume a little bit?
No.
There are times when you get confused or lost, or you're not sure if it's the first time.
Sorry.
Or is this the G major one or the B flat? And
No problem.
So
Thank you.
But very rarely do you say, I stopped because I mixed up. That would be wonderful.
Well,
and all these kids here will love you if you say that.
Well,
but if you invent something, the reason to stop, which covers up the truth, they are also very sensitive. We all get it, we kids down here.
No, when I mix
we
up...
We know when you're bullshitting us.
Okay, fine.
Later on, I became director of a Tanglewood Music Festival with Boston Symphony. Last, 10, 15 years. I was witness many times to that Mr. Bernstein is teaching in Tanglewood School to young conductors and young orchestra. And I was amazed that his way, he has a very, how you call it, same standard when he conducts New York Philharmonic, when he was music director, and when he teaches this young conductor who has no experience, and young orchestra who has no experience, he kind of do exactly same standard or same level talking.
Too soon. No. That's a common thing with young orchestras, even with old orchestras. Ba ba ba, ta ta ta, not waiting.
He approached music as many times as a composer's eyes or composer's ears, composer's mind to approach this score of Beethoven or this score of Bartok, Stravinsky.
What is the whole point of this movement? The TikTok.
TikTok.
It's an essay on TikTok. You write sempre staccato for a reason. When you're now getting tom tom tim, you know, like those things in Mahler, which are or Brahms, which are both dotted and slurred. That's not what he means.
Of course, he doesn't teach you how to conduct these things, but he really teaches what is in the score, what is missing then, what is feeling missing from this young conductor, from this score. And then we go like, almost like analyzing the score, which to me, very interesting and very important approach to young people. I wish I could do it.
How about the upbeat to A? Come on.
Upbeat to A.
He's gone to fight King George on his throne.
So a very interesting, description of his teaching from Seiji Ozawa, one of his pupils, but a person very much involved in Tanglewood. And as a conductor myself, I can so relate to what he said. He's never talking to them in the abstract. You need to look a certain way. You need to move in a certain way. He's saying, look at the score. Look at the notes on the page. What gesture do the notes on the page ask you to make? A. B, I love his point of if you are conducting, I used to say this to players and singers whom I have conducted, if you are looking at the note you're singing or playing, you're behind. You want always to be looking ahead. Where is the music taking you? And he is describing to these young musicians how important it is what happens between beat one, and that one is preparing too. So the conductor is always, always thinking ahead. He started at Tanglewood. He learned what it meant to be a teacher at Tanglewood, and he has carried that tradition on throughout his whole life. Tanglewood stands as a kind of seed that is constantly bearing fruit for Leonard Bernstein throughout his whole life. And that tradition of phenomenal teaching is continuing today in a program that is managed by Alexander Bernstein. It's called Artful Learning, and there's a center for this, and they're trying to train public school teachers in the field of arts education, if we have any arts left in any public schools these days, and trying to develop programs in which the arts are an integral part, not just of an arts curriculum, but of an entire curriculum having to do with math and science and history and literature, and how the arts, not just music, but the arts can bind these together and make them important parts of our lives. Alexander Bernstein says of his dad, he says, my father was deeply committed to the idea of the arts being totally connected to the process of learning and to the idea that you cannot study any particular subject in a vacuum. He always pounded away at this theme of instilling a love of learning in someone. And he believed that you could not be a truly educated person without the arts. He didn't see them just as a nice bonus if you go through your school and they have enough money for an arts program. He says, I know, thrilled by what they are doing in a town like Nashville, which has a big program. And I think he would love the connection in Nashville with country music. Here's a little bit about artful learning.
Artful learning is so much more than putting the arts into schools. Artful learning actually harnesses the arts and the spirit of creativity to energize and interconnect the entire school curriculum.
You give them something in math to hold on to, and you relate it to something in art. And then when they see it again, this hook, comes back and grabs them, and they go, aha! And they can relate it to other things in other contents. That's what it is. It's about interconnectedness between different subjects.
You can see how everything coexists with each other and live in a perfect symbiosis. And it's the same way with this mural that we used pointillism. If you just take one thing away from that ecosystem, everything will just collapse on itself.
I know I will remember this all my life, because you're not just writing something down and looking in a book. You're out doing something and you connect with what you're doing and see the outcome of it.
Kids talking about metaphors and making connections to things that seem very, very separate are building anything else that's as effective as the Bernstein learning model has been for.
So, how does it work? First, teachers in all subjects look at the content they're required to teach by their state. Together, they choose a concept and a significant question. Then, the teachers choose a masterwork to launch their learning journey. Here's an example. Concept,
Relationships.
significant question.
What ingredients are needed to develop and maintain a healthy relationship regardless of the relationship in question? So for our Bernstein project, without knowing it, that the two language arts and social studies, we were studying the Constitution in social studies. And in language arts class, we read The Wild Things by David Eggers.
In each classroom, the kids go through the magical, artful learning
experience.
The students delve deep into the concept as they encounter a masterwork.
Inquire.
The kids dig in and learn more about their subject using the masterwork to pursue their study.
Create.
Students respond by coming up with their own work of creation that expresses their understanding of the information that they have learned.
Reflect.
Now they ask new questions, because, of course, every journey always has another intriguing turn just ahead. The data demonstrates that in every artful learning school, kids' scores are going up. I know my father would be so gratified to see so many students and teachers bursting with creative energy in their classrooms. Artful learning helps kids acquire the skills to be the curious, focused, problem-solving adults we'll need to realize the beautiful world that Leonard Bernstein envisioned for us all.
How wonderful that his family, all three children, each in their own way, have gave them in terms of curiosity, in terms of artistic awareness, in terms of commitment to educating people. And they have taken that and created this incredible artful learning platform for learning that can take place in a variety of schools, in a variety of different settings. So here's the family carrying on this tradition that began of his learning and his teaching at Tanglewood and continued on after this as he made it to the tube. And it's important to remember that Leonard Bernstein came into his own late 40s, all the way through the 50s and beyond. He came into his own at a time when television was in its nascent form, but people were grasping about for programming that could possibly appeal to a broad audience in this whole new medium. Omnibus was created, by the Ford Foundation. And the Ford Foundation was really trying to increase the educational level of the American public in the 50s and 60s. Actually, it has gone on beyond that. And the program featured not just music, not just Leonard Bernstein, but Frank Lloyd Wright was on it, Jack Benny, Orson Welles, William Saroyan. They really were able to. It was like a TED Talk, I suppose, is for us today, where we can in an evening, we can turn on the TED channel and we can learn. And it's the medium of television and Zoom nowadays that is making this possible. And the other format that he took to, and really took to in a big way, was the young people's concerts. The first performance took place in 1958 at Carnegie Hall, and it happened only after a few weeks of his taking over the artistic direction of the New York Philharmonic. And in 1962, they became the first series of concerts ever televised from Lincoln Center. It's interesting, Bernstein conducted a total of 53 of these performances, which were telecast on CBS, and they were syndicated in over 40 countries. And he continued it even during a sabbatical that he took in the mid-60s. And after he left as conductor of the New York Philharmonic in '69, he continued to lead these young people's concerts as a composer well into 1972. And like for me, and my book here, The Joy of Music, these concerts inspired me and a lot of you who are watching today. It's interesting to just go back and look at some of the letters from people who were just thrilled after watching these. One person watching an omnibus show says, "Dear Mr. Bernstein, I'm not a person to write fan letters, but after your I felt this is one letter I must write. I've never enjoyed TV in the 5 years we've had a set until yesterday. Our 7-year-old watched you and loved every second. Just think what a steady diet of music, good music, would do for children." I didn't mean to go on, but just to say thanks and hope we'll hear from you soon. Or one of the producers of the Omnibus program, "Dear Leonard, the returns are in and you have been selected by a landslide. It's been some time since we received such an amount of mail for a feature on Omnibus, and every single letter and telegram has been wildly enthusiastic." Here he is in one of his more famous young people's concerts, introduced by Whoopi Goldberg, talking about what is a melody or what is a phrase.
By the end of 1962, when this concert was performed, he'd been doing them for 5 years and he had it down. He spoke the script, which, as you know, he wrote. He was very natural. He might get a little breathless after conducting because conducting is an incredibly athletic activity, especially when he did it. But he could still talk and get exactly the result he wanted from the orchestra. It must have been hard, but the main impression I always get from these concerts is that he is having an incredibly good time.
You've all heard of Wagner's great opera Tristan and Isolde, and I'm sure you've heard the prelude. Now, this prelude begins with a 4-note motive like this. And immediately after comes another motive, also of 4 notes. Now, the exciting thing is the way Wagner puts these 2 motives together. He makes the second motive begin smack on the end of the first one, so that the last note of one and the first note of the other are joined, locked together, locking the 2 motives securely, like this. Now he adds some marvelous harmony underneath, and this is what you get, the beginning of Tristan and Isolde. Now that's already much more than a motive, or even of 2 motives. It's become what's called a phrase, just as a series of words in language becomes a phrase. And Wagner, by using this method of joining motives together and making phrases out of them, and then sentences out of the phrases, and then paragraphs out of the sentences, finally turns out a whole story, a prelude to Tristan that is a miracle of continuous melody without end, seemingly, even though there isn't a tune anywhere in it. Do you begin to see what I mean by understanding melody in a different way? If you think you don't, just listen to a couple of minutes of this famous prelude now, and I'm sure you'll be surprised to find that you do understand it very well.
It's amazing how, if we look at our own time and the epidemic we've been living through, and all of a sudden, in the midst of, or at the beginning of this epidemic, we discovered a thing called Zoom, which has opened whole new, frustrating at times, and nevertheless, whole new worlds for our ability to teach and to learn and to communicate. And the same thing happened in the early 50s when television and Leonard Bernstein came together. They were made for each other, and he made the most of it. If you ever want to do something in an evening, get onto YouTube and just get one of these young person's concerts. And they're also available on DVD format. So we've had Tanglewood we've looked at, and its important place in his life. We've looked at how much his family is carrying on and enlarging on his love of education. And we explore how television came along at the very right moment for Leonard Bernstein. I want to share, before we take our break with you, another forum for his teaching, and that was in recording. And sometimes we think, okay, here's Leonard Bernstein coming into contact with Kiri Takano and Jose Carreras and all of these great musicians. He even, for example, in a recording session, uses his time there to teach even when he's complaining about the way this person is performing and trying to teach them how to do it right. Here is an iconic passage, video from the recording that he made of West Side Story, and made the mistake of hiring opera singers to play the major roles, which just does not fit the story of Romeo and Juliet. And here he is trying to get Jose Carreras to slow down and taste the breezes that are around him. Here he goes.
Only just out of reach, down the block, on a beach, under a tree. I got a feeling there's a miracle due, gonna come true, coming to me. Could it be? Yes, it could. Something's coming, something good. If I can wait, something coming, I don't know what it is, but it is gonna be grand. With a click, with a shock, funnel jingle, up and down.
You're ahead of me. Pepe, watch me, not the music. And if you make a mistake, we'll go back. Right? You know this. When you look at the music, you sing wrong words. Just look at me. 4 bars, D4. Up into 2.
Jose?
Yes.
Coming. Coming. What I'm saying, coming.
John, please don't do this. Don't give elocution lessons over the microphone, okay? Silly. Madden. 32.
Here we go.
32. Bar 32. Come on.
Please.
Call it.
Okay, stand by, everybody. Something's coming. Take 130.
I don't have numbers, Maestro. I'm sorry about that.
I'll sing it for you. Coming to me.
131.
Coming to me.
Could it be? Yes, it could. Something's coming, something good. If I can wait, something coming.
You went to G major instead of F major. Also, If I can wait, you're not waiting. You're,
Well, maybe we should break and listen to it.
why not? Why not? So, take a break.
Let's take 10.
Just scheiße.
Up a chair.
Up a chair.
Amen. Get it.
That's why I wanted you to hear this.
Stop.
Now what?
I'm afraid we need a retake.
Yep.
Could it be? Yes, it could. Something's coming, something good. If I can wait, something's coming. I don't know what it is, but it is gonna be great. With a click, with a shock, funnel, jingle, doddle, knock. Open the light. Something's coming, don't open, but got the moon one-handed catch.
Getting ahead. Can we start on the G major something, the second ending, in other words? Bar 63.
Okay. Bar 63, take 135.
Something's coming, don't.
Right on it. Huh?
Something's coming, don't know when, but it soon catch the moon, one-handed catch. Around the corner, are whistling down the river. Come on, believer, to me. Will it be? Yes, it will. Maybe just by holding still.
Still. Okay, I think we've got that. Have you got what you want?
Yeah, I think we have.
Okay.
So even in a setting like this, he is able to teach. He wouldn't call it teaching; he'd call it getting it right. But here, and Bernstein is absolutely on the mark. And I hope you can hear that how Carreras basically doesn't get it right. So we're going to take a 4.5 minute break, and I'll see you back here in 4.5 minutes. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Good. I'm sorry, I don't know what the problem is with the volume that people are having. My volume is all the way up, and we've never had a problem, at least in the weeks past. I apologize. I'm not sure what the problem is. Sorry about that. So let's get started again here. Let me share my screen with you. So I thought it might be really helpful to just take a moment, and here we are at week 4. At the end of an hour from now, we will be halfway through our time together. And I'd like to do just a check-in to tell you where I hope we are, but also for you to check in with yourself and see if you're keeping up and sort of seeing the larger picture in all of this. So we started out on the 14th of September, my goodness, looking at Leonard Bernstein in terms of the decades of his life. My hope in the first 2 talks was to kind of get us clear about sort of an overview from many, many feet, looking at the man's life in terms of his lifespan, and then in the words of others. In other words, how did his family describe him? How did his students describe him? How did his public, how did other professional musicians, how did critics describe him? And then last week we began to get a little more deeply into his music making as we looked at him as a conductor, and today we look at him as a teacher. So in these first 4 weeks, I hope that what you have experienced is that we have started from way up at the top in the clouds, and we are slowly wending our way down until we can look at and listen to the man and his music and his life in a much more intimate fashion. So we see him as a conductor last week. This week, we see him as a teacher, those parts being central to his life. And then starting next week, we do 2 sessions on Leonard Bernstein as a composer. Next week, a composer for stage, and the following week as a composer for concert music and a little bit for film. And, and then we are going to spend a session, I like to call it a composer's composer. Leonard Bernstein was a composer who cared about composers, cared about their music, cared about new music. He was presenting new music, in quotation mark, concerts at the New York Philharmonic in the 1960s, long before that was sort of an in thing to be doing. So we'll look at him as he promotes other composers and how he attempts to understand them and communicate their music not only to an ensemble, but to an audience. And then in our last session, we're going to talk about Lenny and his piety. So today, I hope that in that first half, we kind of got a picture of Lenny in which teaching sort of sits at the core of who he is. Looking back at Tanglewood, looking at how his children got a hold of the concept of teaching, how he was able to teach with this new medium of television, and certainly even as we witnessed just before the break, how even in a tense recording session, there's so much to be learned by the way he goes about the process of music making. As a conductor myself, and I was thinking about, I've been living with this man now since whatever, May, when I began working on this class. I've become increasingly aware of what a phenomenal musician he was, and that his composing or his conducting, while a lot of people, particularly Harold Schoenberg of the New York Times, complained it was flamboyant and wild at times, which indeed it seemed to be, but it was a kind of, to me, an honest response. So as we go through our last half of the class today, my hope is that we can take time now to watch him delve really deeply inside a musical score and take time not only to explain it to an audience or to an ensemble, but to bring out in his conducting and in the music he's making the sound that he thinks the composer wanted. We're going to listen to and look at, first of all, the musician Charles Ives, then Dmitri Shostakovich, and we'll end up going way back to the music of Beethoven to explore Lenny's delight in digging deeply into the smallest details of a score, but also his ability to understand the overall message, the overall story that a score is trying to tell. So we start with the American composer Charles Ives. Here's Lenny talking about him.
And this Second Symphony is such a work. It contains very few problems of dissonance, or what used to be called modernistic techniques. Its only problem is one of attitude, our attitude as well as his. Just try to identify with the young Ives, a mere 27 years old, living in a country and a community where being a musician is vaguely reprehensible and not red-blooded American and slightly unmanly, and trying withal to write down the sound images of his world. And this music he heard inside himself was a combination derived from the great works of the German tradition, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Wagner, plus the local music he had already lived with. Hymns, folk songs, patriotic songs, and marches, the sound of Salvation Army bands, college songs, and the like. All of these can be found in this Second Symphony, from Beethoven's Fifth to the fiddling of Turkey in the Straw. You know, Barndine said, "Can you do that?"
I know somebody would love to.
Can you do that? You stand up and do it. You don't have to look at the notes. Not bad, huh? Imagine that mixed with Beethoven's Fifth. And that's not all. You will also hear references to other classical works, to Brahms' Symphonies 1 and 3, and to Wagner's Tristan and Walküre, to Bach, to Bruckner, to Dvorak. But the Ives Symphony never sounds like Brahms or Wagner or Dvorak. It sounds like Ives. That's what I meant by calling him an authentic primitive. His music has all the freshness of a naive American wandering in the grand palaces of Europe, like some of Henry James' Americans Abroad, or perhaps better still, like Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad. The European spirit has, by some Connecticut alchemy, been Americanized. In other words, Ives had a way of tossing odd bits of Americana into the European soup pot, thus making a whole new symphonic brew out of it. That Turkey in the Straw that you just heard so admirably playing, mixed with Brahms' Third Symphony, produces a brand new concoction, very unexpected, very American in flavor, sort of like speaking German with an American accent, or better still, like speaking German with a Bavarian. The list of these oddments of Americana is a curious mixture.
What I love is his ability, and this is in Europe, he's speaking in Europe, and don't you love his deep bass voice? This was recorded in 1987, and he got, I mean, the frog in his throat grew bigger and bigger with each passing year, but I love how he is able to communicate with this audience about a piece of music which to them, particularly as Europeans, feels so strange. Here's a little snippet from his recording with the New York Philharmonic of the Ives Second Symphony. So score study, studying the score was so important to him, and to go in and begin to expose his audiences to all sorts of new music. This was the Ives Second, written right at the turn of the last century, to around 1901. And here he is taking this very American piece to Europe and trying to describe it and bring it alive for his audience. Same thing with the Russian Shostakovich. Here he is studying the Shostakovich Ninth Symphony.
I've just been rehearsing the Ninth Symphony by Shostakovich. Now, here's a question for you. When you hear someone speak of the Ninth Symphony, what do you immediately think of? Beethoven's Ninth, of course. The Ninths, and very good they are too, some of them. But they exist, it would seem, in spite of the fact that for over 150 years, there has been a kind of mystique about Ninth Symphonies, ever since Beethoven's, which must have seemed like the last word on the symphonic subject back then in... It's true that Franz Schubert, a few years later, did write a Ninth Symphony, a masterpiece, in fact, but he didn't know it was because it was never played during his lifetime. Besides, he wasn't counting. He just poured them out one after the other. But then came Schumann and Brahms, who never got past 4 symphonies each, so that they never had to face the awesome problem of following in Beethoven's giant footsteps. But then, moving right along, came Bruckner, who did reach his 9th, a great one. But he didn't live to finish it. And so by the time Mahler arrived at his 9th, we're now in the 20th century, Mahler found himself trapped in a veritable 9th Symphony complex. His superstition about 9th symphonies was now so great that he tricked himself by calling the successor to his 8th Symphony a song cycle, actually a symphony for voices, known as Das Lied von der Erde, but he gave it no number. And only then did Mahler feel free to write his official 9th Symphony, his super symphony, his last will and testament, because it was statistically his 10th. See? Amazing the lengths to which an artist will go in the cause of self-deception. Now, after Mahler, none of the succeeding symphonists got past their 7th or 8th. Curious, isn't it? Until Dmitri Shostakovich, who arrived at his 9th in 1945. At that moment, he was the hottest composer on earth, the one internationally adored composer whose every new work was anticipated like the latest colossal Hollywood movie, especially back in those dramatic days of the war, with the emotional alliance of the West with the Soviet Union. New Russian music was being played everywhere, Prokofiev, Khachaturian, but especially Shostakovich. He was hot to the extent that the American radio networks competed with gigantic financial bids for the right to give the American premiere of Shostakovich's 7th or Leningrad Symphony. And P.S. NBC won and Toscanini played it. Well, here is this famous great Shostakovich faced with Right Symphony. What a challenge, especially for a composer who adored Bruckner and Mahler and Schubert and Beethoven. But the larger challenge was this, that in that year of 1945, the war was finally over and evil crushed. The moment seemed to call for a super 9th, a 9th of 9ths, a massive musical equivalent to War and Peace or whatever. It was virtually a commission from Stalin himself. But here the mystique of the number 9 exerted itself in an odd way, so typical of Shostakovich. He didn't avoid writing one out of either humility or superstition. He simply wrote the least predictable and most surprising ninth that exists. Short, hilarious, an all-out fiesta, gleefully proclaiming, "Hooray, the war's over." In short, Shostakovich thumbed his nose at the great tradition of ninths, although he was perfectly capable of writing colossal symphonies, as we well know from the seventh and eighth that had preceded. But he was a great nose thumber. It has even been suggested that he was thumbing it at Stalin personally.
Wouldn't you love to have a music professor like that, who has this understanding of sort of the scope of history and is able to take you through his or her understanding into that world that is so foreign to you and make it not foreign, help make it accessible. Here is his recording a little bit of that famous Ninth Symphony of Shostakovich. Lenny never made it to 9 symphonies. He made it through 3 of them, but his interests were so scattered with so many possibilities. So he becomes a champion of Charles Ives. He becomes a champion of Shostakovich. These were all new names and concepts and sounds to the audiences in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But when he comes back to Beethoven, he displays for us his incredible curiosity about who Beethoven was, how he wrote music, and how he wrote music, but how he would borrow from himself, how he would work through in a compositional process that took many, many, frequently years. So we have, in terms of Beethoven, we possess today amazing sketchbooks where Beethoven was trying out ideas. And Bernstein got very excited about this. And I want to close today by sharing with you, again, another iconic young person's guide to the or young person's concerts, young people's concerts. I want to go back as Bernstein takes this concept of sketches for a symphonic work that we all know, in this case, the Fifth Symphony. He goes back and delves into, with children, with youth, delves into the choices that Beethoven made. What a fascinating way to approach this composer.
Now, as we said before, Beethoven had this ability more than anybody before or after him, but it was a great struggle. Now let's try to follow this struggle. To begin with, Beethoven chose to use 12 different instruments to comprise his orchestra in the first movement of the Fifth Symphony. Starting at the top of the page of the conductor's score, we find first the flute, then the oboe, the clarinet, the bassoon, the horn, the trumpet, timpani, first violin, the second violin, the viola, the cello, and the double bass. Now, of course, the made-up of these 12 instruments multiplied anywhere from 2 to 18 times. As the conductor views this score, his eye has to follow all these 12 instruments simultaneously across the page. However, for his opening few bars, Beethoven did not wish the entire orchestra to be playing, and so he dismissed 5 of these 12 instruments. First the oboe, then the bassoon, horn, trumpet, and timpani. Here is the manuscript as he started it, with the remaining 7 instruments accounted for. But there is something crossed out, the flute part. So we know that Beethoven, at least for a second, was going to include the flute in his opening. Now, why did he cross it out? Let's hear how it would have sounded with the flute left in. You hear those high piping tones of the flute? They don't seem somehow to fit into the brusque, rude atmosphere of this opening. Beethoven clearly wanted the strongest, most masculine utterance he could get at the beginning of this symphony, and he therefore decided to orchestrate entirely with instruments that play normally in the register of the male speaking or singing voice. The flute, of course, is the instrumental equivalent of a soprano voice, and therefore is intruding here like a delicate lady at a club smoker. So out came the flute. Now let's see how masculine it sounds without him. You see, many of us assume that when we hear the symphony today, it sounds so simple and right that it must have spilled out of Beethoven in one steady gush. But not at all. Beethoven left pages and pages of discarded material, similar to these sketches here, enough to fill a whole book. He rejected, he rewrote, he tore up, he crossed out. He sometimes altered passages as much as 20 times. I've come up with some curious and interesting results. Let's see what they are. We already know the opening bars of the symphony, almost too well, I should say. Now, we also know the answer to this. Good. Now Beethoven has made his initial statement. What does he do now? How does he go on to develop it? This is the way he goes on to develop it. Fine. But here is a discarded sketch, which is also a direct and immediate development of those same 4 notes. It goes like this. Not very good, not very bad, taken all by itself, but it is a good, logical development of the opening figure. Now, what would the music have sounded like if Beethoven had used this sketch as the immediate development of his theme? We can find out easily enough by simply putting it back into the symphony, and then it will sound like this.
What a wonderful way to take us into Beethoven's thought process and to be able to bring it alive for his audience, and it was television that made it possible. So as we come to an end today, I hope that we've been able to hear Bernstein. I think he at one point in his life said, I've seen this quote somewhere, said, you know, I never get tired of studying a really good score. He could return to Beethoven time and time again. This, the performance, the teaching performance that you saw was way back from the early 1950s, and he kept returning to this piece. You know, it's really interesting. I think that sometimes we sort of give up on pieces of music or on composers, and yet the truly great moments in music we can constantly return to. And here, even today, how many years later, we can take this experience of Lenny teaching a piece of Beethoven from hundreds of years before, making it so present. So I hope in our discussion today we've kind of begun to see that his modus operandi was really teaching, no matter what he was doing, whether he was teaching young people to conduct or to play or to sing or perform one of his pieces, or whether he was teaching an audience in a concert in Europe, or whether he was working in the medium of television. He was everywhere, trying to pull back a curtain on music so that we all not only could understand it, but enjoy it. And he got the germ, he got the bug when he was a student, when he was only 22 years old, went to Tanglewood for his very first summer and went almost every summer thereafter. They used to talk about when Lenny is on the campus, we have Bernstein weather, that things always cleared up for a performance by Lenny when he was in residence at Tanglewood. And we see how his family have cared so much about his legacy to keep it alive, and how television has been so vital of the coming together, the synchronous nature of Lenny and television, in a sense, bursting on the scene at just the right moment to teach us all about the power of music. And then finally, seeing how he can delve into a score, be it the minutest detail that we saw as he taught young conductors how to teach an orchestra, how he criticized Carreras for not following the score, which in this case is his own score, but then seeing how he can see a world picture of Charles Ives, of Shostakovich, and certainly of Beethoven, and not only to understand them, but make them understandable to all of us. So thank you for being here today. There will be an assignment in the mail in the next couple of days for you, and it will have to do with next week as we look at Lenny as a composer. Have a great week, everybody. Thank you so much.